I never told this story while the war was still going on. Not because it was classified. Not because anyone ordered me to stay quiet. I simply knew that if I told people what happened that night, most of them wouldn't believe me. For context, I worked as a paramedic in a small town in northern Ukraine during the first months of the full-scale invasion in 2022. By then, every shift felt unpredictable. Roads changed overnight. Bridges disappeared. Cell towers stopped working without warning. Sometimes we would drive 40 minutes only to discover the village we were heading toward had already been evacuated. You stopped expecting normal. Still, nothing prepared me for the call we received just after 2:40 in the morning. The dispatcher sounded unusually nervous. "I've got something strange." Those were her exact words. No address. No patient information. Just a location. Old Forest Road. Kilometer marker 18. I frowned. "What's the emergency?" There was a pause. "I don't know." "You don't know." The call lasted 11 seconds. What did they say? They didn't. I thought the connection had dropped. They never spoke? No. What did you hear? She hesitated. Footsteps. I looked across the room at my partner, Victor. He raised an eyebrow. Then the dispatcher continued. "And breathing. Heavy breathing. That's all." The line disconnected before we could trace the number. Normally, that kind of call wouldn't justify sending an ambulance, but nothing was normal anymore. People often couldn't speak because they were hiding, or injured, or too terrified to make a sound. Victor grabbed the keys. "We're going outside." The town was completely black. No street lights. No windows. Only the pale glow of the moon reflecting off empty roads. As we drove north, the radio remained silent. No new calls. No updates. Just the steady sound of the diesel engine. About 20 minutes later, we reached the location the dispatcher had given us. There was nothing. No crash vehicle. No people. No lights. Just a narrow forest road disappearing into darkness. Victor stopped the ambulance. "You hear that?" I listened carefully. Wind. Tree branches. Nothing else. Then tap. Tap. 3 metallic knocks. Very faint, coming from somewhere ahead. We both looked through the windshield. The road was empty. Another 3 knocks echoed through the forest. This time slightly closer. Victor switched off the engine. The silence became overwhelming. Even the wind seemed to disappear. I stepped outside with my flashlight. The cold air hit immediately. "Emergency medical service." I shouted. "If anyone's there, answer." Nothing. I swept the flashlight across the trees. Old pines. Broken branches. Snow melting into muddy ground. No footprints. No movement. Then I noticed something. About 30 meters ahead stood a bicycle. Just standing there. No rider. No bags. No damage. It hadn't fallen over. It was perfectly upright in the middle of the road. Victor walked beside me. "That's impossible." There wasn't even a kickstand holding it up. The front wheel turned slowly in the wind. As if someone had let go of it only seconds earlier. I moved closer. The handlebars were wet. Not from rain. From fresh condensation. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. Then our ambulance radio came to life by itself. Neither of us had touched it. A burst of static filled the forest. Then a voice. Broken. Barely understandable. Double quotes. Dawn single quotes. T. Double quotes. More static. Double quotes. Turn. Double quotes. Silence. Victor looked at me. "Did dispatch just call us?" I picked up the radio. "Dispatch. Repeat your message." No response. Only static. Then. 3 metallic knocks. Again. This time. Behind us. Asterisk for a second. Neither of us moved. The 3 metallic knocks echoed through the trees, and then stopped as abruptly as they had started. I slowly turned around. The ambulance stood exactly where we had left it. Its headlights illuminated the empty road behind us for maybe 30 meters, before everything disappeared into darkness. No one. No vehicles. Nothing. "You heard it too?" I asked. Victor nodded without taking his eyes off the road. It came from behind us. We walked back toward the ambulance. I checked underneath it with my flashlight. Nothing was hanging loose. No branch had fallen against the body. No loose equipment. The sound hadn't come from the vehicle. Just as I stood up, Victor pointed toward the driver's door. "Look." Someone had written something in the dust covering the side window. 3 letters. SOS. I froze. "I cleaned these windows before our shift." "So did I," Victor replied. There wasn't anything there. The writing looked fresh. The dust had been wiped away with a fingertip. Neither of us had heard anyone approach. I opened the driver's door and grabbed the radio again. Dispatch. This is Ambulance 2. We've arrived. There are signs someone may still be here. The reply came instantly. To instantly. Copy. Double quotes static. Double quotes. Leave. More static. Double quotes. Immediately. The transmission ended. I frowned. That didn't sound like dispatch. It didn't. Victor agreed. He checked the radio frequency. It was still on the correct emergency channel. Before either of us could say another word, a flashlight suddenly appeared deep between the trees. One flash. Pause. To flashes. Pause. One flash. It wasn't random. Someone was signaling. There. I whispered. The light disappeared, then appeared again farther away, almost as if whoever held it was walking deeper into the forest. Victor looked at me. What do you think? I hesitated. Everything about the situation felt wrong. But if someone was injured, we couldn't simply drive away. We follow. Leaving the ambulance running, we entered the forest. The ground was soft with melting snow. Our boots sank slightly into the mud with every step. The flashlight appeared again, always just far enough away that we couldn't reach it. Every time we got closer, it disappeared behind another group of trees. After about 5 minutes, I realized something strange. We couldn't hear the road anymore. No engine. No wind. Nothing. Only our footsteps. I stopped walking. Victor. He looked back. Listen. We stood completely still. Absolute silence. Not even birds. I don't like this, he said quietly. Neither did I. I checked the GPS on my phone. No signal. Not surprising. But the offline map should still show our position. Instead, the screen displayed a blinking arrow in the middle of a completely blank grid. No roads. No forest. Nothing. Just empty gray. That's odd. Before Victor could answer, we both smelled something. Smoke. Fresh smoke. Not from artillery. Not from a wildfire. Wood smoke. Someone had lit a fire nearby. We followed the smell for another minute until the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing. In the center stood an abandoned wooden cabin. Its roof had partially collapsed years ago. One window was boarded shut. The other was broken. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the chimney. Victor stared at it. Someone's inside. The front door stood slightly open, just enough for darkness to fill the gap. I stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked beneath my boots. Emergency medical service. I called. If anyone needs help, answer us. Nothing. I pushed the door open. The cabin was surprisingly warm. A small iron stove burned quietly in one corner. On the table sat a steaming metal cup. Someone had poured tea only moments earlier. But there was nobody inside. Not a single person. Victor checked the back room. Empty. The attic ladder. Empty. There was only one thing lying on the table beside the cup. A folded map. I opened it. Someone had circled our exact location with a red pen. Below it, written in shaky handwriting, were just 6 words. You're looking in the wrong direction. A loud crack echoed outside. Not a gunshot, a tree branch snapping. Both of us turned toward the doorway. Something had just moved past the cabin window. Fast. Fast to identify. Victor immediately switched off his flashlight. Did you see that? I nodded slowly. For the first time that night, it felt like someone wasn't waiting for us to find them. It felt like someone had been watching us the entire time. Neither of us spoke. Victor slowly folded the map and slipped it into his jacket. Someone left this here for a reason, he whispered. But how would they know we'd come? I didn't have an answer. The cup of tea was still giving off steam. Whoever had been inside couldn't have left more than a minute earlier. I walked over to the stove. Fresh wood had just been added to the fire. The logs were barely beginning to burn. This place is abandoned, I said. Victor shook his head. No, it was abandoned. Before I could ask what he meant, the radio on my belt crackled. Ambulance 2. It was dispatch. At least it sounded like dispatch. Double quotes. Status check. I grabbed the handset immediately. This is Ambulance 2. We found an occupied cabin, but no patient. Static interrupted me. Then the same voice replied. Repeat your location. I looked down at the map. Old Forest Road. Kilometer 18. There was silence. A long silence. Finally, the dispatcher answered. Negative. What? There is no cabin on Old Forest Road. Victor looked at me. I switched the radio to speaker. The dispatcher continued. Our satellite map shows you're still beside your ambulance. I felt a chill run down my back. That's impossible. We've been walking for at least 10 minutes. Another pause. Then she asked a question that made no sense. Can you still see your headlights? I frowned. No, you should. Before either of us could respond, the transmission ended. The cabin suddenly felt much colder. Victor walked to the doorway and looked outside. His flashlight swept across the clearing. Nothing. No footprints. No fresh tire tracks. Only the dark forest surrounding us. Then he froze. Look at the ground. I aimed my flashlight downward. The mud around the porch was untouched. There were only two sets of footprints. Mine. And Victor's. Nothing else. No prints leading to the cabin. No prints leading away. Yet someone had clearly lit the stove, made tea, left the map. Someone's messing with us, Victor muttered. He sounded less convinced than he wanted to. Just then, I heard it again. Tap. The metallic knocking. This time it came from underneath the cabin. Both of us instinctively looked at the floor. Another 3 knocks. Closer. As if someone was hitting metal directly beneath our feet. Victor crouched beside an old wooden hatch near the stove. There, he pulled on the rusty handle. The hatch didn't move. It was stuck. Together we forced it upward. With a loud groan, it finally opened. Cold air rushed out. Stone steps disappeared into complete darkness below. I shined my flashlight down. A cellar. Old shelves lined the walls. Broken glass. Wooden crates. Nothing unusual. Until the beam landed on something reflective. A mobile phone. It was lying face up on the floor. The screen was still on. Someone had called emergency services. The call timer had stopped at exactly 11 seconds. Neither of us moved. I slowly climbed down the stairs. The phone's battery was nearly dead. One notification remained on the screen. Emergency call failed. Bellow was the time. 2:41 a.m. Exactly 1 minute before dispatch had received the mysterious call. Victor picked up the phone. The battery is still warm, so whoever used it, they can't be far. Then he noticed something else. This isn't the strange part. He turned the screen toward me. The wallpaper showed a family photograph. A man, a woman, and a teenage boy, all smiling in front of a blue farmhouse. On the back of the phone case, someone had written a name with black marker. Andry. The same name was printed on the medical ID bracelet lying beside the phone. I stared at it for several seconds, because only 6 hours earlier, I had treated a wounded volunteer with that exact name. He had been transferred alive to the regional hospital. There was no possibility he could also be here. None. Victor looked at me. You know him. I nodded slowly. I met him tonight. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we'd experienced so far. Somewhere above us. Outside the cabin, we heard an engine start. It wasn't our ambulance. The engine outside roared to life. Victor immediately switched off his flashlight. The cellar was swallowed by darkness. We stood perfectly still. For several seconds, all we could hear was the vehicle idling above us. Then, gravel crunching. A door slammed. Footsteps. Heavy boots. Not one person. Several. I slowly climbed halfway up the cellar stairs and looked through the narrow opening. 3 flashlights swept across the cabin. White beams cut through the darkness, moving slowly from wall to wall. Someone entered. I could hear voices. Quiet. Impossible to understand. Victor leaned closer. Military. I don't know. None of them sounded like soldiers. There were no radios. No commands. Just short conversations. Almost whispered. One of the men stopped directly above the cellar hatch. I held my breath. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. He stayed there for nearly 10 seconds. Then he walked away. A drawer opened. Metal objects clinged together. Another voice said something. Silence followed. Finally. The front door closed. An engine started again. The vehicle drove away. Neither of us moved for another full minute. Only when the sound disappeared completely did Victor whisper, I think they're gone. We climbed back into the cabin. Everything looked exactly the same. The fire still burned. The tea was still warm, but something had changed. The map was gone. Neither of us had touched it. It was right here. Victor pointed at the table. I know. Instead, a folded notebook now lay in its place. Old. Dark green cover. The pages were damp. Inside were dozens of handwritten entries. Dates. Times. Vehicle descriptions. Road numbers. Coordinates. Most of it looked like someone's personal logbook. Then I noticed the final page. Written in large block letters. If you found this, they are all ready to close. Below the sentence was another list. March 7. White van. Escape. March 10. Blue pickup. Never arrived. March 14. Ambulance. The last line was unfinished. Only one word had been written. Tonight. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Someone had written about an ambulance before we had even arrived. Victor turned another page. A rough map had been sketched by hand. Our ambulance was marked with a small red cross. A dotted line led from the road to this cabin. Someone had predicted our exact route. Then the radio suddenly came alive again. This time the voice was perfectly clear. Ambulance 2. Respond immediately. It was dispatched. No static. No interference. I grabbed the handset. Go ahead. We've been trying to reach you. For how long? There was a pause. Almost 3 hours. I looked at my watch. To 58 a.m. That couldn't be right. We had left the ambulance less than 30 minutes ago. Dispatch. What time do you have? 5:47 a.m. Neither Victor nor I said a word. The dispatcher continued. Military units found your ambulance abandoned on Old Forest Road. They've been searching the forest since sunrise. My mouth went dry. Abandoned. Where's our driver? There was silence on the radio. Then confusion. Double quotes. Driver. You reported only one medic on duty tonight. I slowly turned toward Victor. He was staring at me. His face had gone completely pale. What did she just say? He whispered. I answered without taking my eyes off him. She says, I came here alone. Victor didn't reply. He simply looked down at the notebook in his hands. Then back at me. His expression had changed. Not fear. Recognition. As if he had suddenly remembered something he had been trying to forget. Very quietly, almost to himself, he said, I was wondering when you'd realize. Victor stared at me for several long seconds before shaking his head. No, that isn't possible. He grabbed the radio from my hand. This is Victor Hertsenko, partner of Ambulance 2. Do you copy? The dispatcher answered immediately. Who is speaking? My name is Victor. Silence. Then confusion. We don't have a Victor assigned to Ambulance 2. He frowned. There must be some mistake. You've worked with me for 3 years. The dispatcher didn't answer that. Instead, another voice came over the radio. Older. Calmer. Listen carefully. We don't have time to explain everything. If you found the cabin, double quotes. Check behind the stove. The transmission ended. Victor and I looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. I walked back to the iron stove. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I noticed that one of the floorboards behind it had fresh scratches. Someone had moved it recently. Together we slid the heavy stove aside. Beneath it was a narrow wooden compartment. Inside lay a small metal box. No lock. Just a faded red cross painted on the lid. I opened it. There were no valuables. No weapons. Only documents, medical records, handwritten notes. Photographs. The first picture showed the same blue farmhouse from the wallpaper on Andrew's phone. The second showed a family standing beside an old van. The third showed the cabin we were standing in. But it wasn't abandoned. It had been converted into a hidden first aid station. Stretchers. Medical supplies. Generators. The date on the back of the photograph read March 22, 2. Victor unfolded another document. It was a handwritten report. Several civilian families are hiding between the old forestry roads. Cell service is gone. They cannot reach emergency services. Anyone who finds this cache must continue searching north. My heartbeat quickened. This isn't a trap. Victor nodded slowly. It's a guide. Just then we heard another sound. Not an engine. Voices. Many voices. Children. I rushed outside. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest. Not far away. We followed it for less than 2 minutes before the trees opened into a shallow ravine. Below us, hidden beneath camouflage nets stretched between the pines, stood nearly 20 civilians. Families. Children. To elderly couples. A pregnant woman. Everyone looked exhausted. One elderly man stood up the moment he saw our uniforms. We thought nobody knew we were here, he said quietly. We've been hiding for 4 days. One of the women stepped forward. It was Andrew who told us to wait. He said if he couldn't come back, someone else eventually would. I looked down at the phone still lying in my hand. Suddenly everything made sense. The strange emergency call. The 11 seconds of breathing. The bicycle. The cabin. The notebook. Someone hadn't been trying to scare us. Someone had been leaving a trail. Not to hide the truth, but to make absolutely certain that someone followed it. Victor smiled for the first time that night. We should call for buses. I reached for the radio. This time the signal was perfectly clear. Dispatch. This is Ambulance 2. We found them. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher answered with a voice that sounded almost relieved. How many survivors? I looked across the ravine. 20 frightened faces looked back at us. I smiled. More than anyone expected. Asterisk the first military truck arrived just after sunrise. Then another. Within 30 minutes, the quiet forest had transformed into an organized evacuation point. Soldiers distributed blankets and bottled water, while volunteer medics checked every civilian one by one. Several children had mild hypothermia, an elderly woman needed insulin, and one man had an untreated leg fracture that was already several days old. As I helped load patients into the evacuation buses, I couldn't stop thinking about one question: where's Andrew? The elderly man who had spoken to us earlier lowered his eyes. He never came back. What do you mean? He left 3 nights ago. He said he was going to reach the main road and call for help. We waited. He never returned. I looked at the phone still resting in my jacket pocket. The emergency call. 11 seconds. Heavy breathing. No words. If Andrew had managed to make that call, why hadn't he spoken? A captain from the Territorial Defense approached us carrying a folded map. You'd have found this group. We followed the trail. Victor answered. The officer looked surprised. What trail? I showed him the notebook, the phone, and the photographs from the cabin. He slowly flipped through every page. His expression changed. I know this handwriting. You do? He nodded. It belongs to a volunteer medic. He organized evacuation routes during the first weeks of the invasion. His name was Andrew. Everything suddenly fell into place. The notebook wasn't predicting the future. It was documenting every successful evacuation, every family that escaped, every vehicle that made it through the forest. The unfinished line that simply read, tonight hadn't been about us. It had been waiting for someone to finish the story. The captain looked toward the hidden cabin. We searched this area last week. There was nothing there. I frowned. What do you mean? No cabin. Victor and I exchanged confused looks. It was right there. We turned around. The clearing was empty. The old wooden cabin was gone. Only a blackened stone foundation remained beneath the trees. The captain noticed our expressions. That building burned down during the first week of March. No one has been inside since. I said nothing. Neither did Victor. Maybe we had walked into the wrong clearing. Maybe exhaustion had distorted our memory. Or, B, there was another explanation none of us could prove. Weeks later, after the evacuation was complete, investigators managed to reconstruct what had happened. Andrew had reached the forest road carrying nothing but his phone and a paper map. He tried calling emergency services several times. The damaged cell towers allowed only one connection. 11 seconds. Just enough for dispatch to receive the location. Not enough for his voice to come through. He never made it back to the families he was trying to save. But the location remained in the emergency system. A call with no words. A place with no explanation. Just enough information for someone to keep looking. Months later, Victor and I drove that same road again while transporting medical supplies. The bicycle was gone. The clearing was empty. No cabin. No footprints. Nothing remained except the old stone chimney, barely visible between the trees. Victor stopped the ambulance for a moment. You know, if dispatch had ignored that strange call, I nodded. 20 people would have spent another night out there. Maybe they wouldn't have survived. He looked back at the road before starting the engine again. In this job, he said quietly, sometimes the smallest clue is the difference between finding someone and never knowing they were there, even today. I still think about those 11 silent seconds, not because they frightened me, but because they reminded me that sometimes the most important call you'll ever answer, the one that almost tells you nothing at all,